There is a moment when a person realizes that what they once called self-love was never truly internal. It depended on something external: approval, attention, reassurance, validation. As long as those things were present, there was stability. When they disappeared, that stability collapsed. This realization is not dramatic, but it is destabilizing, because it forces an admission: what felt like inner strength was actually conditional reinforcement. The illusion was not that relationships mattered. The illusion was that dependence on them was harmless. From early conditioning, most people are trained to outsource their worth. Compliance is rewarded with warmth. Deviation is corrected with distance. Approval becomes a currency, and withdrawal becomes a warning. Over time, this teaches a quiet lesson: peace does not come from internal coherence, but from emotional accommodation. You learn to adjust before conflict appears. You anticipate reactions. You soften truths. You abandon standards subtly, all to preserve connection. Each adjustment feels small, but each one transfers power outward. When worth relies on response, leverage follows. This is why validation is inconsistent. Scarcity maintains control. When approval must be earned rather than assumed, behavior becomes malleable. The person who needs reassurance is predictable. The person who fears withdrawal is controllable. This is not cruelty. It is structure. The world operates on these mechanics whether they are acknowledged or not. Self-love, in its real form, begins where this dependency ends. It is not an emotion and it is not indulgence. It is a structure. It is the decision to remain loyal to long-term integrity even when short-term discomfort is guaranteed. It is the refusal to betray standards for relief. Self-love is not how kindly you speak to yourself when things collapse. It is how rarely you abandon yourself before collapse occurs. One of the first illusions that must be dismantled is the need to be chosen. Many people unconsciously believe that selection is proof of value. Being wanted, preferred, or picked becomes evidence of worth. As a result, they wait. They wait for messages, invitations, recognition. In that waiting, they place themselves beneath others. Psychologically, the mechanism is simple: when you need to be chosen, you submit to the chooser. The correction is not arrogance. It is orientation. You stop auditioning for belonging and begin evaluating access. When proximity to you becomes something earned rather than requested, the dynamic reverses. People feel this shift before they understand it. You are no longer seeking inclusion. You are assessing compatibility. Emotional reactivity is another leverage point that must be reclaimed. Most people are taught that feelings require expression and that emotional intensity justifies action. In reality, unchecked reaction creates vulnerability. Anyone who can provoke you can steer you. Anyone who can destabilize your emotional state can disrupt your judgment. Emotional discipline does not mean suppression. It means ownership. You allow emotions to exist without granting them authority. Over time, this restraint becomes visible. Your calm under pressure unsettles others because it denies them influence. Silence replaces explanation. Pause replaces impulse. Power consolidates quietly. Boundaries, at this stage, stop being statements and become behaviors. Access, once given freely, loses value. When there is no consequence for overstepping, escalation follows. The correction is not confrontation but withdrawal. Distance, not argument. You stop negotiating respect and start enforcing standards through availability. Explanation becomes unnecessary. People learn faster when they feel loss of access than when they hear lectures about it. As this internal structure forms, something subtle but irreversible begins to happen. You stop explaining yourself. Not to be mysterious, but because explanation itself starts to feel unnecessary. Most explanations are not acts of clarity but acts of defense. They are attempts to secure understanding, permission, or exemption from judgment. When your alignment is firm, consensus is irrelevant. You know why you act. That knowledge replaces the need for approval. At this point, self-love begins to function as internal authority rather than emotional reassurance. Authority does not persuade. It sets conditions and enforces them consistently. You begin noticing how often people test limits under the guise of humor, concern, or curiosity. These tests are rarely conscious, but they are real. In the past, you may have responded with reassurance. Now, you respond with neutrality. The test yields nothing. Over time, the testing stops. This is not because people suddenly become respectful. It is because respect becomes the most efficient response. Human behavior follows incentives. When access to you requires composure, honesty, and restraint, those qualities surface. When it does not, chaos enters. Self-love, in its mature form, is the act of structuring your life so that only aligned behavior can reach you. You also begin to recognize how much emotional exhaustion you once mistook for empathy. Constant availability, constant responsiveness, constant emotional labor, these were not signs of depth. They were signs of porous boundaries. You were absorbing what did not belong to you. As you withdraw from this role, guilt may appear. That guilt is conditioning residue, not evidence of wrongdoing. It fades with consistency. Solitude changes shape. Silence no longer feels like absence. It feels like clarity. You no longer rush to fill space with noise, conversation, or distraction. Stillness becomes usable territory. Thought sharpens. Observation improves. Patterns become visible, both yours and others. You begin to see how often intensity is mistaken for intimacy, how emotional disclosure is used to accelerate closeness without foundation. You listen without attachment. You allow disclosure without surrendering discernment. This is containment. Containment offers no spectacle. It is quiet, disciplined, and unreactive. But it is where power stabilizes. When you are no longer flooded by the emotions of others, perception becomes clean. You assess without distortion. You delay decisions without anxiety. Time returns to you. Most people live reactively, moving at the speed of their triggers. Whoever controls tempo controls interaction. When you slow deliberately, you disrupt the rhythm. Others rush where you remain steady. They reveal more because they are filling silence you can inhabit. Information, paired with restraint, creates leverage, not manipulation, but optionality. You are no longer dependent on outcomes. You can walk away without loss because your sense of self is not tied to result. This is why your presence becomes heavier. You are not anchored to approval, so you are not easily moved. Identity solidifies. Motivation becomes irrelevant because motivation is emotional and unstable. Identity is not. When you decide who you are and act accordingly regardless of mood, behavior gains consistency. You stop asking what feels right and start asking what aligns. Over time, internal conflict decreases. Anxiety fades not because circumstances improve, but because contradiction ends. Unreachability emerges naturally. Not disappearance, but restraint. You become selective with attention and deliberate with engagement. Not everything earns a response. Not everyone deserves access. Silence gains weight. Presence becomes intentional. You are no longer emotionally available on demand, and the dynamic recalibrates. At the highest level, need dissolves. This does not mean isolation. It means independence. You still desire connection, recognition, intimacy, but you no longer require them to validate your existence. They enhance life, they do not define it. Without need, manipulation fails. Fear loses leverage. Choice becomes clean. Some will respect this shift. Others will test it. Some will attempt provocation to restore familiar dynamics. None of this requires confrontation. Consistency teaches more effectively than explanation ever could. You become selective with energy. Not every opportunity deserves pursuit. Not every conflict deserves engagement. Attention becomes guarded. Time becomes protected. This is not arrogance. It is stewardship. Confidence settles, not loud, not performative, but quiet and immovable. You are comfortable being misunderstood. You are unaffected by comparison. Your reference point is internal. External fluctuation registers but does not destabilize. Power changes definition. It is no longer influence over others, but mastery over self. The ability to remain aligned under pressure. To withdraw without resentment. To engage without attachment. Eventually, you realize that what you once feared, being unchosen, unvalidated, alone, has lost its weight. Those fears were never about isolation. They were about identity instability. Once identity stabilizes internally, rejection becomes informational. Silence becomes neutral. Solitude becomes spacious. You stop managing perception. Reputation becomes secondary to coherence. Being respected is no longer confused with being liked. Neither matters more than self-alignment. The burden lifts. Self-love becomes indistinguishable from self-governance. You do not indulge impulses that weaken you. You do not remain where you must fracture yourself. You do not negotiate with standards you have already defined. There is a quiet finality here. No striving. No announcement. Just maintenance. Discipline without applause. Loyalty without reinforcement. This is rare because it requires letting go of dependency without becoming bitter. Boundaries without hostility. Strength without spectacle. But once chosen enough times, it is no longer a choice. It is law. You move calmly, not because the world is gentle, but because you are internally ordered. Chaos cannot hook you. Provocation cannot rush you. Validation cannot inflate you. Criticism cannot collapse you. You are not unfeeling. You are unbreakable. And in the end, the world does what it always does when it encounters something stable. It adjusts. Not because you asked it to, but because there is nothing left to move.